Hey guys, I hope you're doing well. If this is your first time here, my name is Tiffany. I have been struggling to conceive for a long time and I finally feel motivated to talk about some of my experiences. This video kind of covers the second half of our fertility journey so far. So if you haven't seen the first part where I talk about everything leading up to our IVF process, I will include the link above somewhere. As I've said in previous videos, I am hoping that by sharing this information of the experiences we've gone through, hopefully I can help other people that are experiencing infertility, especially those who have to go through IVF, with a focus on what the experience is like if you have low AMH or DOR, which is Diminished Ovarian Reserve, or if you are struggling with both male and female factor infertility. I'm hoping that by us having more open conversations about it, we help to break the stigma around it, and hopefully we just feel less alone because this process can just feel so isolating. And if you want to stick around to the end of the video, I'm going to be talking about advice I have for those who are going through IVF, especially if you're in a similar situation as us. So with that said, let me go ahead and jump into our IVF process so far. So at the end of 2022, I went to an IVF clinic for the first time that was the one that was recommended to me by a friend who had a successful IVF pregnancy and birth through the doctor at this clinic. This is where I kind of did the preliminary, more thorough tests to kind of see what's going on. I did some day 3 blood work, so this is day 3 of my cycle. And at that time, my AMH was 0.8. Again, AMH stands for Anti-Mullerian Hormone. It's the hormone that's directly correlated with your ovarian reserve. So my ovarian reserve is on the lower side. That's why I've been diagnosed with diminished ovarian reserve. And my FSH, which stands for follicle stimulating hormone, which is pretty self-explanatory. It's just the hormone that is in charge of stimulating your follicles that you have in your ovaries. My FSH was 15.5, which is on the higher side. And I think that that means that my body is working pretty hard to stimulate my follicles and they're just not really like responding the way they should. I think you want that number to kind of be under 10 generally. So this wasn't really on my radar at the time. Like nobody had specifically said, oh, your FSH is a little high, but I think that all of this is kind of probably somewhat common when you have low AMH. You know, your body's just not quite operating the way it's supposed to when it comes to producing follicles. And they also checked my AFC, which is antral follicle count. That's done through a transvaginal ultrasound where they check how many follicles you have at a given time during that cycle. And my AFC at the time was 12, but I think that that's still considered below average for my age at the time. And during this first ultrasound, we discovered that I have some ovarian cysts, which sounds so scary, but actually they're very common. They tend to just come and go on their own and are usually nothing to worry about. Sometimes they can get bigger and stick around for a while, and that's when, you know, it's a problem that really needs to be looked into. But they said, you know, it's okay, like they're normal. We'll just let them go away, but you know, you're gonna have to come back later and let them know when I would be ready to start my first IVF cycle. And we weren't ready to start right away, so there was a period of time in between then and when we actually started. And during this period of time, that's when I read it starts with the egg, which, as I said in the last video, kind of made me go crazy. That's when I started swapping out products for safer things that, you know, don't have these nasty chemicals and things that you don't want in your system. I started taking more supplements, tried to be generally healthier, eating better, exercising more, which I'm not great at. I could always be better. And during this time, I was also trying to research as much as I could, try to understand how IVF protocols work. I did this because I was hoping I could lessen the amount of surprise in the process. But spoiler alert, nothing can really prepare you for this process, especially before your first egg retrieval cycle. You really are just like a human-sized science experiment, but I'll get more into that later. Skipping ahead to early 2024, this is when we were actually ready to start. Stress levels were pretty high. I was feeling pretty anxious about the process. I think I was really hoping that we could just knock this out in one try and get lots of healthy, normal embryos, and that's not necessarily what's gonna happen for every person on their first try. So I did an ultrasound after ovulating, the cycle before the cycle we wanted to do the IVF. This was to see where I was at the month before, make sure there's no cysts, and I got the all clear to start estrogen priming, which is common for people that have low AMH and DOR. I think generally it's to kind of help suppress a lead follicle from getting way ahead of the other follicles, because typically typically, if you do ovulate normally, you're gonna have one follicle each month that is your, chosen follicle that will release an egg and that whole process. But during the IVF process, you want all of your follicles to kind of grow at the same speed, same pace, so that you can increase your odds of success with your egg retrieval, retrieving as many eggs as possible. So that's what I had to do leading up to my first IVF cycle. So at the beginning of my first IVF cycle, the supplements I was taking was a prenatal, vitamin D because I'm very deficient, vitamin E, CoQ10, methylfolate, melatonin before bed, and myo-inositol, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, my AFC, so antral follicle count at the start of this cycle was 6, and my AMH was 0.4. So both of these numbers had dropped literally in half since the end of 2022 and the beginning of 2024. So not a great mental start to this cycle. I was trying not to freak out about how much my numbers had dropped, but it is pretty normal for numbers to fluctuate from month to month. I think high stress levels and cortisol can really impact these numbers as well, which I tend to think is probably the number one factor of why my numbers are so bad, but really there's no obvious clear way to know. But it's hard for me not to think that because I don't smoke, I don't drink, I don't do crazy things, so like what could possibly be contributing to these horrible numbers? But I digress. So although I don't know what is kind of standard dosages for ladies that don't have low AMH or DOR, I started this cycle with kind of higher doses of Gonal-F and Menopur. And just a few days in, my ultrasounds were showing I already had a lead follicle that was kind of way ahead of the other follicles. The other follicles were not really responding well, not really growing. So our doctor gave us the option to either continue and try to retrieve that one follicle, knowing that the others weren't really going to be an option, or to just start over and we wouldn't necessarily have to pay for an entirely new cycle. They would work with us. So we decided to start over in the hopes that the same thing wouldn't happen again, try a different protocol and see how it goes. So although we decided to cancel that cycle, I did still have to take a trigger shot to induce ovulation, and I took Novorel, which I had kind of a bit of a reaction to. It made my skin really itchy around my belly, so that wasn't very fun. And it was recommended to try timed intercourse, just so you're not like totally wasting these medications you just used to kind of amplify your ovulation, that follicle, the egg that was in that follicle, but obviously it didn't work. So that's how my first cycle went. And then between that cycle and starting the next one, we kind of had like a big family emergency where I had to drive from Southern California to Las Vegas because my dad was in the emergency room. And this is where he was officially diagnosed with Parkinson's, which was all very scary and traumatizing for our family. And then while at the hospital, he told me he wanted to sell the house and for me to help him. So literally, stress at the maximum levels during this time. There were so many big things happening at that time, and it was just so not fun to have to juggle IVF at the same time. So about a week and a half to 2 weeks later, we started IVF Attempt number 2. This time my AFC was 8, so a little bit better. I started estrogen priming a couple days earlier than I did last time. We also added Clomid into the mix. My doctor decided to not have me do Menopur this time around and to do small doses of Gonal-F and to just increase gradually, so small and steady. I remember being particularly annoyed that during ultrasounds, follicles would kind of come and go. So sometimes you'd have a certain number on each side, and then at the next ultrasound they would just disappear, or they wouldn't really be growing in size. So it just didn't seem consistent at all. And there's apparently no real rhyme or reason as to why they come and go. I think this is like somewhat normal. Maybe it's more normal for women like me. I was annoyed. But eventually we got to the point where I did still kind of have a lead follicle, but there was one that was not too far behind, so at least this time I kind of had 2 instead of 1. But again, the other one's just not really responding great. I started taking Cetrotide to kind of suppress ovulation, and then eventually took a trigger shot, which was the HCG Pregnal, so not the same as last time. Luckily, no reactions. And I remember feeling a little bit more bloated than usual, even just having 1 or 2 follicles leading up to egg retrieval time. And as a side note, this is super embarrassing. I don't know why, but I have a phobia of taking pills. I've always had it, never been able to swallow pills. I I gladly chew pills just to not have to deal with the like gagging reflex and things I have when I try to swallow pills. So during this cycle, I was trying really hard to try to train myself to take pills like with food so that I could try to make it easier. Didn't really go well, but was making a little bit of progress. But it did make me worried that maybe I wasn't absorbing the, the medications from the pills as well as I could have, because I was kind of chewing them up and trying to get them down as fast as possible. But I digress. So I am having to reshoot this portion of my video because I was not filming any of it, and it's important to keep in. So it's the next day. I don't have makeup on. I don't care. Whatever. So we went in for our first egg retrieval. We were feeling anxious but optimistic. I've only ever been under anesthesia once. It was to get my wisdom teeth removed, and it didn't end up going super great because I had nerve damage. Half my lip and my chin are numb and still are to this day. And unfortunately, I kind of had an annoying situation with the anesthesia this time as well. They had a really hard time trying to get the IV into my veins. I have super difficult veins that are like really small, and they like to hide, like they're not super close to the surface of my skin. So whenever I get blood drawn, I often have a hard time. Now I know to be super incredibly hydrated. It seems to help with the process. But during this first egg retrieval, they took like literally 45 minutes to try to find a spot. They kept poking and prodding me and trying different spots without any success. They ended up using like a hot compress to try to get my veins to kind of like thicken up and, be girthy enough to puncture. And eventually they ended up doing it in my left hand, kind of like here somewhere. It was very strange, but they managed to get it. This was definitely like an added stressful thing to deal with before my first egg retrieval. But when they brought me into the operating room, everyone was very nice. It happened super fast. I don't really remember much of it. Just woke up in my hospital bed later. They told us that they were able to retrieve one egg, and the smaller follicle ended up being empty. So I was pretty bummed about that. They told us that they would be fertilizing with ICSI and that we would receive a call the next day. My pain was pretty mild, pretty manageable. I was a little bit bloated, but it wasn't too bad. So on day one, the next day, we received a call and they told us that the egg did successfully fertilize, and that was exciting news. But then on day 3, they called to tell us that the egg did not make it past day 2. It had stopped growing and developing. And we were crushed because this was our only embryo. We didn't have 2, and it didn't work. So obviously we were devastated. I remember just like crying in bed for days, and it just sucked knowing that we went through 1.5 cycles and we had nothing to show for it. But at that point in time, we just kind of had to just go about our lives until we were ready to start again. So at this point in time, we had to make a lot of big life decisions. Both of our dads were not doing well health-wise, and we decided that we would need to move home. So even though we loved being in Southern California, at this point we were living in Huntington Beach and we loved it, we had to move home and help take care of family. But before we moved, we decided to go check out another clinic in Southern California that was recommended. I am part of a few Facebook groups, like a Southern California IVF group, and I was hearing a lot of good things about this clinic, and I started kind of looking on their website and getting a sense of how things worked there. And they offered IVF packages for a much more affordable price, and I was hearing so many good things about the doctors. So we decided to go check out a seminar that they were holding where we got to meet the doctor and talk to some coordinators, and they took our information and we felt really good about it. So we decided, yes, let's go ahead and proceed with this IVF clinic when we're ready to start again. So then we moved home, and I had to help my family move across town. It was a lot. Again, peak stress levels for just months on end in kind of mid-2024. Not my favorite year. However, I was still in touch with my doctor at our previous IVF clinic and asked if he would be willing to let me get my DHEA tested. I was hearing a lot about how DHEA could potentially be helpful for women that have low AMH, DOR, but it is a hormone that you do need to check because you don't want to be taking it if you already have too much of it in your system. It really should only be taken if your levels are on the lower side. So I wanted to get mine tested to see where I was at, and my results came back that it was on the lower side. So I asked my doctor if it would be safe to take, just in a small amount, not the full dosage, and he said that that would be fine. So cut to 2025. We were hoping that maybe we could start IVF in the spring, so we started taking our supplements early in the year. I adjusted my supplements slightly, so I was still taking a prenatal, vitamin D, vitamin E, CoQ10, methylfolate, but decided to add omega-3s and DHEA. But I also stopped melatonin because I felt it was preventing me from sleeping well. It was doing the opposite of what it should do. I think you're not supposed to take it for long periods of time, and because we didn't ever really know when we were gonna jump into IVF again, I just continued to take it. It seemed like shortly after I stopped taking it, I was able to sleep better. And I also stopped the myo-inositol because that kind of has the opposite effect of DHEA, so it doesn't really make sense to take them both at the same time, though both are supposed to help with your egg quality. Started to eat better again, exercise more. I got my blood work done again, and my AMH actually improved slightly. It went from 0.4 to 0.6, so like literally right in the middle of where I had started and where I was before my first IVF cycle. So I was actually really excited that my numbers had improved some. It gave me some hope that you're not just always going to decrease, that there is some fluctuation that can happen. And my stress levels were pretty high before I had gotten this test, so that means that despite that, it's still improved, which was just nice to know. So we were trying to start in spring, and then we both got COVID, which is so stupid that it's still so easy to catch when our bubble of exposure to other people is so small. And we told our clinic, and they said that they usually recommend that people that have had COVID wait a couple cycles or couple months, 2 or 3, before they start IVF because it can affect your fertility. I think even when you get a fever, it can affect your fertility. I think there's more research for men, so like affecting sperm badly because it raises your body temperature, but there's less data on women. But still, to be on the safe side, if you get COVID, probably best to just wait 2 to 3 months. And then the following month, my husband got the flu, which luckily I didn't get, but it was so frustrating to have all these things kind of preventing us from getting this process moving along. So then we had to wait another 2 to 3 months after that. Also at this point in time, James's test results weren't quite as good as they were last year, and our clinic recommended that we just come out to Southern California and have James do a test there, so the embryologists could determine if ICSI would be an option with his current results. Luckily, they said that his results were fine for ICSI, and we also decided to just go ahead and freeze some sperm so that there's a few vials available, just so we have the peace of mind that, you know, that is taken care of if needed in the future. So we finally got the green light to proceed, and we are very happy. So finally, we were able to start our third IVF attempt, more like second and a half egg retrieval attempt. So although we're living in Las Vegas, our clinic gave us the option to do outside monitoring, which is basically monitoring outside of their clinic, but locally here for me. So I was doing my blood draws and my ultrasounds here in town at 2 different clinics, and then these clinics would send the information over to my primary clinic in Southern California so that the doctors there could look over the results and suggest dosages and kind of my treatment plan from there. And this option, although annoying to kind of have to deal with 3 different clinics at the same time, helped to save some money. It's just kind of a headache to deal with. So leading up to the cycle, I kept asking my clinic if I should start estrogen priming, because that's what I did last time. And I wanted to make sure that I got my ultrasound and blood work done so that they could decide whether that would make sense or not. And ultimately they said it was up to me whether I felt strongly about estrogen priming or not, but they said it might be worth not trying this time because maybe it was over suppressing me. And so there was definitely a sense of like, I do trust them and I want them to do what they think is best, but I'm also anxious about this process and I don't want to have a lead follicle again. So I put my trust in them, and ultimately I think that was the right choice. But I remember being pretty nervous about it at the beginning. And my clinic kind of specializes in giving lower doses to women because typically, especially if you have something like low AMH, DOR, you're probably going to respond better with lower doses of medication. So like a mini IVF type of protocol, which I'm totally fine with because I know I didn't respond great with higher doses of medications. And you know, you're putting less medication in your body and it costs less because you're not using as much medication. So the cycle prior to the cycle, we wanted to try to do the IVF. My AFC was 3, and so again, cut in half in the span of a year. So wasn't thrilled about that. But then the next month during the actual cycle that we were starting, my AFC was only 2. So I was not happy about that going in. Like it was literally 12 in 2022. Oh, it just sucks so bad. So at the beginning, I was only taking Provera pills and Gonal F in very small doses, like very small. And I'm happy to report that I finally managed to find a system that worked for me to get the pills down, and it's so stupid. It's so simple, but it's just swallowing them with a little bit of applesauce. I don't know what it is, but it doesn't trigger my mechanism, my gagging mechanism. I just always have to take pills with applesauce, but whatever. It's better than nothing. I realize I am like a 5-year-old child. I don't care. And I think during the first or second ultrasound in this cycle, my ultrasound technician said that she thought she might be seeing like a flat polyp in my uterus. So when you hear the word polyp, it sounds even scarier than a cyst. And I started to freak out because I was like, does polyp mean cancer? Like what is it? What do I do? I've never had a polyp show up in an ultrasound before, so this was alarming to me. But she said that generally it's not gonna affect an egg retrieval. It's just something that I might have to get addressed before an embryo transfer if we get to that point, because you wanna make sure that your uterus is like totally ready and nothing weird going on before you do an embryo transfer. So I think I only had 3 or 4 monitoring appointments before my egg retrieval, and at the last one it was looking like I again only really had 1 follicle responding, and the other follicle she said was looking kind of like a cyst, so not probably going to be viable. So not feeling the best, but kind of knew we'd probably only have 1 this time again. So eventually I took a dual trigger, which I hadn't done before. I took the Pregnal and Lupron at the same time. We drove to California to our clinic, stayed the night before my procedure, and the morning of, I woke up early to take my medication, and I woke up feeling very nauseous and very sick and like feverish, not well. The medication I was waking up to take was ibuprofen, so after I took it, I felt a lot better pretty quickly, thank God, because I was like, I am not gonna go to the emergency room or hospital before my egg retrieval, like we're getting these eggs out, you know what I mean? So that was a little scary, but luckily only lasted a little bit, but strange. I don't know if it was a reaction to the Lupron because I've never had that before. That's all I can think of is that it was the Lupron, but I really don't know. So then we went off to our clinic to get ready for my egg retrieval. There was a really nice female doctor who kind of helped prep me for surgery, and she was really nice and patient and took the time to do my ultrasound, kind of see where my follicles are, see what the situation is. And she told me, well, you have 3 follicles here. You have your big one, but you also have 2 kind of smaller ones in your right ovary. Let's have the doctor check those out too. And so I kind of brushed this off like, oh, I think they might be cysts or something, like I think we're just gonna have the 1. But I was kind of optimistic about the idea of, oh, well, maybe we can retrieve 3 and just see what happens. Also, as a note, this was kind of a wild experience because I was not under anesthesia for this egg retrieval, or not fully sedated. They just did a local anesthesia for this. So I was awake and aware of everything that was happening. They gave me these like squeeze ball pill things to hold, and it was kind of scary. I could see they had a screen where I could watch what they were doing during the egg retrieval process, but I was feeling very stressed and overwhelmed and was just trying to like not look at what was happening on the screen. And so my doctor came in and he did my egg retrieval. He retrieved the first one, the big one that we were expecting, and then he almost was going to just not get the other 2, but the lady doctor said, oh, you know, there's actually some smaller ones here, like let's go ahead and retrieve those too, because we were just under the impression I only had 1 this whole time. So he went ahead and retrieved those, and then they like brought them over to the embryologists, which were just like right there, and they had a screen I could look at. And it was so funny because the embryologists were like showing me on the screen, and they're like, oh, we got 3 eggs, and they were like, look at the screen, and I was just like, what, huh, what? Just super distracted and not fully processing that they had actually gotten 3, that all 3 had like eggs in them, because I really thought I was only gonna just have 1. So that was exciting, but also like nerve-wracking. They were very nice, but I was just too distracted to process any information at that time because it's uncomfortable and kind of painful. It seemed like the anesthesia maybe wasn't doing a whole lot because I could feel everything, but it probably was helping, I'm sure. So then I was instructed to just bed rest for, 15 minutes or so and then head home. So we just went back to our hotel, hotel and I rested for the rest of the day, and my pain was very mild, really wasn't bad at all. I feel like my recovery was better and quicker than it was last time, so we drove home the next day. I think they told us that they'd give us an update on day 2 or 3, so because this was all a bit of a blur for me, it's hard for me to remember exactly when we talked to our doctor, but I did talk to my doctor over the phone. We asked him if it would be an option to freeze our embryo, if we had an embryo, on day 2 instead of letting it progress to day 5, which is typically what you want to do so that it gets to the blastocyst phase before you freeze, just because it's stronger, it's more developed. But because our only embryo from last year didn't make it to day 3, we were afraid that this might happen again. So we talked to him and asked his opinion, and he said, absolutely, we can freeze on day 2. So this was comforting for us to know. So on day 2, we got an update, and we kind of had like an official report that we could look at that explained what was happening with our 3 embryos. Although I don't know which was which, I'm assuming kind of the smallest one that they ended up retrieving arrested, and then another one failed to fertilize. But one of them did successfully fertilize and did make it to day 2, and in fact already had 6 cells, which is really cool and a little more developed than what's standard for a day 2. It's kind of more in line with like a day 3 embryo. So this was pretty exciting to us, and they actually graded it. Grading systems can kind of differ between clinic to clinic, but they graded it pretty decently. So not perfect, not bad, kind of in the middle. And of course, you know, I immediately start Googling, like, is it good or bad for a day 2 embryo to have 6 cells? And as far as I can tell, it's probably mostly a good thing, because it just means it's a little eager, it's just a little more developed in the process. Hopefully that means that it will survive the thaw just fine and, you know, be just fine to transfer. Obviously, earlier in the process, we had kind of always imagined that we'd let our embryos go to day 5 and that we'd have a blastocyst and that we would be able to genetically test it and make sure it's normal, but that's just not in the cards for us right now. So we're just gonna make the most of our one little embryo that is now frozen and waiting for us to do our first frozen embryo transfer. So obviously it is an emotional roller coaster when you find out, hey, you got 3 eggs instead of 1, which wasn't what we were expecting. So it gave me some hope that maybe the 3 or 2 or whatever would make it. Obviously they didn't, we just have the 1. So I am a little sad about that, but I'm also so happy that we have an embryo. I know not everybody gets embryos from their egg retrievals, and although I feel like our situation is really kind of not great in the scheme of things compared to other women, I'm still very grateful that we have our embryo, and now I get to prepare for my first frozen embryo transfer, which feels really exciting. Like, we've never gotten this far in the process, so we are optimistic. It's hard because obviously we want to be realistic and know that, you know, a day 2 embryo is probably not as likely to succeed as a day 5 embryo, but when it comes to transfers especially, like, anything can happen. I know it's pretty common for women to have, you know, a day 5 blast that is genetically normal that they've already tested, and they transfer it and it just doesn't stick, it doesn't implant. And then maybe they do another transfer later with an embryo that's not graded as well as that perfect, you know, PGT tested normal embryo that they had before, and then that one sticks. A lot of times women transfer embryos that aren't tested, and sometimes they stick. So in our situation, we just want to give our embryo the best chance. Typically embryos are happier in their natural environment, which is the uterus, so they may develop better in utero as opposed to a petri dish. But then some people argue that if it wasn't going to make it to day 5 in a petri dish, it's probably not going to make it to day 5 in the uterus. But ultimately, like, it's going to stick or it's not going to stick. So we're just going to hope for the best and see what happens. But in between our egg retrieval and our upcoming frozen embryo transfer, I actually ended up doing a hysteroscopy and an ERA cycle, which I may cover in a separate video if you're interested. But all is good. I don't have a polyp. It was nothing to worry about, so I'm thankful for that. But eventually, when I feel up to it, I will probably do an update video on how our first frozen embryo transfer goes. And we're just crossing our fingers that it's positive news. So now I'd like to close this video with some advice I have for you if you were going through IVF, especially if you have low AMH, DOR, or any other male or female factor infertility issues. So my number 1 piece of advice is don't expect anything. Everything about this process is just unpredictable, especially if you have male or female factor infertility issues. I feel like that even adds more of an element of unpredictability. You really can't anticipate what your response to medications is going to be like, how you're going to respond to certain procedures. You really are like a science experiment, and you kind of have to do a round of IVF to get a sense of how you respond to medications and all of this in the process, so that maybe things can be adjusted for your next cycle. And it sucks because it feels like you're just throwing away a cycle, all this time, all this money, this toll you're putting on your body. A lot of the times that's common, and it's really hard to hear because I was hoping that we could just get it done in one try, like I said, but that, looking back, I know that that was probably unrealistic of me to think, and you may be one of these lucky people that can do it in one try. God bless you, that is wonderful. I am not one of those people, so I'm just putting that out there in case you end up having a similar situation as us. Your hormone levels are going to fluctuate on a regular basis. Your AMH, your FSH, your AFC, all of these things are going to change. Don't get married to the idea of this is what it's going to be like and it's just going to get worse through time. There are so many variables that can change those results. And like I said before, you know, your lifestyle changes. You can make an impact on these numbers to some degree, but not a huge degree. So don't panic, don't overthink too much about these numbers. They just tend to fluctuate. Fevers can affect your fertility in a negative way, especially for men. So make sure you plan accordingly if you have gotten sick recently, and just try to prevent as best as you can getting sick, because you don't want to delay this process any further if you're ready to start. Freezing sperm can give you peace of mind, especially if you have male factor infertility. If you are in a situation where you need to do outside monitoring, just make sure that you have the time to manage it, because there's a lot of moving pieces when you do outside monitoring. If you like your doctor, try to trust the process. If you feel strongly about trying like a certain protocol and they're open to working with you based on what you think, that's great. But also certainly trust their opinion and their advice if they're kind of leaning more towards, let's try this and see what happens, especially if you've already done a cycle and a protocol that didn't really work for you. Like a lot of these IVF doctors, they know what they're doing, so try to trust the process and trust them. Don't freak out if you have cysts or polyps. Generally, you're going to be okay and they're not going to be something you need to worry about. But obviously, if they continue to stick around, they change in size, shape, this is when you want to make sure that you get these issues addressed. But the odds that you're going to have cancer or something like that are so small, so just try not to panic. It just might mean that you need to wait a cycle or two, or have a hysteroscopy done, something like that, where they can remove any abnormalities, fibroids, all of this stuff. If you are working with a limited amount of embryos, try to have a plan for those embryos before your egg retrieval day. So leading up to our IVF process, we always imagined, oh, well, we're gonna let our embryos grow to day 5 and we'll have blasts and then we'll test them. But when you only have 1 or 2, that might not necessarily be the best option for you. So just try to think about different scenarios. Like if you end up having 5, maybe you try to freeze 2 of them on a certain day, like day 3, and you let the rest grow to day 5, or whatever number you feel comfortable with. But if you only have 1 or 2, it might not be best to just hope that they make it to day 5, especially if you've had issues with that previously. If your clinic's willing to work with you, try to talk to them about like, what can we do in this situation if we have this amount of embryos? I think that this is just important to get taken care of before you get to this point in time, and then you're just nervous and stressed and making big decisions quickly without really thinking them through, because having a combination of options might be better than just sticking with one choice for any scenario. With that said, I think PGT testing can be a very controversial subject. I completely understand wanting to, wait till day 5, genetically test, and only transfer normal embryos over because you want to prevent potential miscarriage and loss and, implantation failure. But on the flip side of that, there are plenty of scenarios where women transfer embryos that are untested and they still stick and they end up being normal live births. There's obviously not a one-size-fits-all to anything IVF related, but I do think that we should try to respect other people's decisions about whether to PGT test, whether not to, but just know that sometimes good things can still happen even if your embryos aren't tested or they aren't graded perfectly. You just never know what's gonna happen, because sometimes those genetically tested normal embryos just don't stick. It's really such a crapshoot, all of it. So just be prepared for anything, really. You just never know what's gonna happen. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you checking in on how we're doing in our fertility process. I'm hoping that some of this information was helpful to you in some way. I hope that you are doing the best you can, whether you are going through infertility or not. Thank you again, and I hope to see you back later.